Hi, so this is the first Writing Wednesday where I'm going to do this book talk series over the summer where I talk about books that have had a big impact on me, both as a reader and a writer. And this week I'm sitting in my classroom at work, having wrapped up school for the summer, talking about To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, To Kill a Mockingbird is a modern classic that I have a long relationship with as a teacher. I have been teaching it to grade 10s pretty much ever since I started teaching back in 1986. I think it's a great story. I realize there are a lot of political questions around whether it is still a good and accurate book to teach as a representation of racism in the American South. I think it is. I think it has to be read in the context not of just the time it's set, but of the time it's written, and also from the perspective of the fact that it is a white person's story about racism, which is not going to be the same as an African-American story about racism. I think you need both kinds of stories. The thing I want to focus on in looking at it as a writer is what Harper Lee does in this novel with point of view. So To Kill a Mockingbird is told from the point of view of Scout Finch, who is between 6 and 9 years old over the 3 years that the story unfolds. And I think Harper Lee does a more interesting and generally a better job of handling a child's point of view in a novel that is intended mainly for adult, or at least, older teenage readers, than almost anyone has ever done that I know of. It's apparent from the beginning of the book that the person telling the story is meant to be the adult Jean Louise Finch, who was called Scout as a child, remembering her childhood. And that's the voice that you hear very early on in the novel when she says, "Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned to red slop. Grass grew on the sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square." You get some beautiful description there that gives you a real sense of the setting and time and place, but you also get that adult voice of an adult looking back at childhood and telling you about the place where they grew up. But for most of the novel, that's not the voice you hear. You hear the vocabulary of the adult Jean Louise. It's written very much as an adult would write, but what she tells us and what she understands is what the child Scout would have. Very occasionally, you get a flash forward into the adult perspective, as in this scene at the end of chapter 9, where Scout is eavesdropping on a long conversation between her father, Atticus, and her uncle Jack, talking about things that she doesn't fully understand. Near the end of the conversation, Atticus catches her, acknowledges the fact that she's eavesdropping, and tells her to go to bed. And the chapter ends, "I scurried to my room and went to bed. Uncle Jack was a prince of a fellow not to let me down, but I never figured out how Atticus knew I was listening, and it was not until many years later that I realized he wanted me to hear every word he said." That's a rarity in To Kill a Mockingbird, that flash forward to the adult perspective and saying, "It was not until many years later that I understood." She doesn't do that a whole lot. Most of the time she keeps us locked in the head of 6 or 7 or 8-year-old Scout and tells us only what Scout understands. And that's a really neat trick. Most evident, I think, once we get into the meat of the story, which is the fact, as pretty much everyone knows, that Scout's father, Atticus, is defending a black man who's accused of raping a white woman. And the amazing thing is that this whole story of a rape trial is narrated for us by a child who is too young to even fully comprehend what the sex act is, much less what rape is. And we can see this. We see what Scout understands, and then as the reader, we see around the edges of it. But the adult Jean Louise doesn't do a lot of telling us, "Here's what I realized later." That's left for us to figure out. So, for example, in chapter 14, when there started to be a lot of talk about this rape case, Scout realizes that she doesn't fully understand the word. And when she asks their maid, Calpurnia, she's told to ask her father about it. "They can go loose and rape up the countryside for all of them who run this country care," was one obscure observation we met head on from a skinny gentleman when he passed us, which reminded me that I had a question to ask Atticus. "What's rape?" I asked him that night. Atticus looked around from behind the paper. He was in his chair by the window. As we grew older, Jem and I thought it generous to allow Atticus 30 minutes to himself after supper. He sighed and said rape was carnal knowledge of a female by force and without consent. Well, if that's all it is, why did Calpurnia dry me up when I asked her what it was? You get such a great sense there of the fact that Atticus is doing the best he can to answer her questions honestly, but without giving her too much information. So he gives her a technical definition of rape, which she accepts, but it's very clear to the reader that Scout still does not really know what rape is. So as a reader and a teacher, I love To Kill a Mockingbird for a lot of reasons, But as a writer, I love it particularly because it's a model of how to do a first-person point of view so skillfully and to make us so aware of what the narrator does and doesn't understand. And I don't know any other writer who does that better than Harper Lee in To Kill a Mockingbird. Next week I'm going to be back with some more book talk, talking about a Newfoundland novel in a Newfoundland setting, Galore by Michael Crummy. See you then.